Imagine it's 15th of August, 1971. You are a 36-year-old shipping clerk living in Marseille, France. Every morning you walk past the harbor before the sun burns through the sea mist, carrying a leather satchel. You carry a lunch of bread and sardines and the small brass key to the apartment you rent above a bakery on Rue de la République. Your wife keeps the household cash in a blue tin above the stove, and your savings sit in a bank book with neat stamped lines. On good weeks, you talk about buying a used Peugeot, so your children do not have to take the tram to visit their grandparents. The radio speaks of exchange rates in Washington in the same tired tone it uses for weather reports. So you let it hum in the background while ships unload American grain, Algerian oil, and crates of machine parts. You handle labels you do not bother to read. Money feels solid. Not rich, not easy, but solid enough to build a life on. If you have ever wondered why central banks suddenly start buying a metal that earns no interest and just sits in a vault, stay with me. What you are about to hear is not a theory. It is a pattern. It has happened before. And it always changes how people see money once they notice it. And if you find value in this kind of historical clarity, subscribing takes 2 seconds and keeps you ahead of what most people never see coming. That evening, President Richard Nixon goes on television. He says the United States will suspend the convertibility of the dollar into gold. In plain English, the promise at the center of the post-war money system is being switched off. You do not hear the floor collapse under your feet, because collapse almost never sounds like thunder. It sounds like a calm voice at a lectern while the beams inside the house begin to split. Over the next years, prices will rise, currencies will move in ways ordinary families do not control, and the old idea that money is anchored to something outside politics will begin to fade. This is the story of what central banks buy when they stop trusting one another. Sometimes they buy the safest paper in the system. And when even paper begins to feel like borrowed air, they buy gold. Not because gold is magical, not because it predicts the future, but because gold is one of the few reserve assets that is not someone else's promise to pay. That is why this matters. When trust cracks at the top of the system, the shock does not stay in marble buildings and closed-door meetings. It travels outward, into wages, savings, mortgages, pensions, prices at the market, and into the feeling ordinary people have when they look at their bank balance and wonder whether the number on the page still means what it used to mean. Before we go further, there is something important to understand. A central bank's reserves are like the spare oxygen tanks on a long dive. They are what a country uses when the water turns dark, if imports still need to be paid for, if the currency is falling, if banks need foreign money. If investors are running for the exits, reserves are the stockpile that buys time. But most reserves are not piles of cash in a basement. They are claims on somebody else, a deposit at another central bank, a government bond, a currency issued by another state. In normal times, that is fine. In calm weather, an umbrella borrowed from a neighbor is still an umbrella. The problem begins when the storm is not local, when the fear is about the neighbor, too. That is the hidden mechanism behind this whole story. Central banks do not suddenly become romantic about shiny metal. They move when they start doubting the reliability of the promises that sit inside their reserves. Will this currency keep its value? Will that government still honor convertibility? Will those bonds still be liquid, which means easy to sell fast without taking a painful loss? Will sanctions block access? Will another central bank lend in a panic, or will it protect itself first? When those questions get sharper, reserve managers climb a ladder. At the lower rungs, they still trust the club, so they buy the safest claim inside the club, often U.S. Treasury debt. After the Asian financial crisis of 1997, many countries did exactly that. They piled up dollars as self-insurance, which means protection they built for themselves because they no longer trusted rescue to arrive on time. But when the distrust reaches the club itself, when the problem is no longer price but permission, countries move toward assets with less counterparty risk. Counterparty risk is a dry phrase. It simply means the danger that the person on the other side of the deal cannot or will not keep the promise. Gold sits at the end of that ladder. It does not pay interest. It does not grow. It does not innovate. But it also does not depend on another government's signature. Gold is the fire escape key hidden behind the glass. This brings us directly to the first part of the story. Long before Nixon, long before modern sanctions, central banks had already shown what happens when trust gives way to hoarding. In the late 1920s, the world was trying to rebuild a stable money system after the wreckage of the First World War. The arrangement many countries used is often called the gold exchange standard. That sounds technical, but the idea was simple. Central banks did not need to hold only gold. They could also hold currencies that were supposed to be as good as gold, mainly pounds and dollars. The whole thing worked only if everyone believed those promises would hold. It was a bridge built partly from steel and partly from painted wood. From a distance, it looked strong. France became one of the countries that stopped liking the painted wood. After the franc was stabilized under Raymond Poincaré, the Bank of France began pulling harder toward gold. A key law in 1928 helped formalize the return to gold convertibility. Then, something crucial happened. Instead of comfortably holding large amounts of foreign exchange, the Bank of France increasingly converted pounds and dollars into bullion. Even more important, it did not fully offset this by expanding money at home. In effect, it absorbed gold from the system and locked much of the monetary effect away. Economists call that sterilization. The plain English version is this: gold flowed in, but the bank did not let that inflow spread life through the rest of the system like blood through an arm. The numbers were enormous. French gold reserves rose from about 29 billion francs in 1928 to around 82 billion francs by 1932. France's share of world gold reserves jumped from roughly 7% in 1926 to 27% by 1932. The world as a whole had more gold by then, but France had swallowed almost all of the increase. It was as if a passenger on a crowded ship began stacking lifeboats inside one cabin, while everyone else was told to remain calm on deck. And what did that mean for ordinary people? It meant that the shortage of monetary breathing room hit everyone outside the vault. World prices fell by about 34% between 1929 and 1932. Falling prices can sound good at first. Cheaper bread, cheaper coal, cheaper clothing. But in a debt-heavy system, deflation, which means prices and wages dropping together while debts stay fixed, works like a vice. Shopkeepers earn less, farmers sell crops for less, factories cut wages or close, debts become harder to pay because the money coming in is weaker while the amount owed does not shrink. In Germany and Austria, banking stress became severe. In Britain, pressure mounted until the country left the gold standard in September 1931. Across Europe and beyond, unemployment spread like winter mold under the wallpaper. Look at the mechanism carefully. France was not causing every problem in the world by itself. The United States also played a huge role. But the pattern matters. The moment the Reserve Center stopped trusting reserve substitutes and demanded the real thing, the whole system tightened. Gold did not save the world from panic in that moment. It intensified the scramble because one major player wanted the asset that did not depend on anybody else's promise. That is the first lesson. When trust weakens inside a reserve system, neutral assets are not just protection. They become magnets. And magnets pull hardest when everyone is already losing balance. If the entire global money system depends on people not asking for the one asset behind the promise, is it stable at all? Or is it only stable until enough important players get nervous? Drop your answer in the comments. Seriously. Because what I am about to show you next is the part of this story that most people never hear, and it changes everything. This leads to the second part of this story. After the Second World War, world leaders built a new system at Bretton Woods in 1944. The design looked elegant. Other currencies would be tied to the US dollar, and the dollar would be tied to gold at $35 an ounce. In practice, that made the dollar the hinge on which the whole door swung. For years, it worked well enough. Trade expanded, recovery spread, confidence returned. But the system contained a crack in its own foundation. The United States had to supply the world with dollars so trade could grow. Yet the more dollars it supplied, the more foreign holders could eventually ask for gold. This was the Triffin dilemma. The simple version is a shop issuing more and more gift vouchers while keeping the same number of goods in the back room. By the mid-1960s, the math was becoming uncomfortable. By 1966, official dollar liabilities exceeded the U.S. monetary gold stock. If enough central banks showed up asking to convert their dollars into bullion, the vault could not satisfy them all. That is when distrust stopped being an abstract fear and became a strategic choice. Charles de Gaulle saw the danger clearly. On 4th of February 1965, he announced that France would begin systematically converting excess dollar reserves into gold. His advisor, Jacques Rueff, argued that a reserve system built on another country's paper claims gave that country an unfair privilege. France was saying, in effect, we no longer want the ticket, we want the seat. The reaction was not theatrical, it was bureaucratic. Gold moved, pressure rose, confidence thinned. The London Gold Pool, created in 1961, had to intervene more and more. Its initial support limit was $270 million. By the time the system broke, that limit had climbed to $2.57 billion. Between 1965 and March 1968, U.S. monetary gold fell from about $15,258 billion to $11,009 billion. The pool collapsed on 15th of March 1968. Most ordinary people did not watch bullion shipments. They watched grocery bills, mortgage rates, pay packets, and the evening news. But the tension at the top leaked downward. The late 1960s and early 1970s brought inflation pressures and currency realignments. When Nixon met with advisors at Camp David from 13 to 15 August 1971, the decision he announced was framed as emergency policy. Close the gold window, freeze wages and prices for 90 days, add a 10% import surcharge. To families, it sounded like government action. To central banks, it sounded like confession. The promise had become too expensive to keep. Gold settled the question no paper promise could settle. If trust in the issuer fails, the paper is a delayed argument. Gold is final payment. A reserve system can survive many things. What it cannot survive for long is a quiet realization among key players that the anchor is smaller than advertised. And that takes us back to our man in Marseille. He's not on a dealing floor in London. He's not in the Élysée Palace. Yet the world just shifted beneath his savings all the same. The harbor still smells of salt and diesel the next morning. The bakery still opens. The bank book still exists. But the age in which money felt tied to something outside politics is ending. The wallpaper looks the same. The house no longer is. From 1971 to 2000, global central bank gold holdings fell while currency reserves rose. Paper won the century. But then the crises of the 21st century began to teach central banks an old lesson in a new language. The global financial crisis of 2008 was one shock. The euro area crisis was another. Then came the weaponization of finance. For reserve managers, that changed the meaning of safety. Central banks have been net buyers of gold every year since 2010. In 2022, central bank demand for gold hit about 1,136 tons, the highest annual figure in modern records. The trend continued through 2024. Look at who was buying. Turkey, China, Poland, and India reported massive purchases, making it 3 straight years above 1,000 tons. Russia reduced its exposure to US dollar assets and built its gold stock aggressively after the annexation of Crimea in 2014. Then, the West froze around half of Russia's reserves. Every reserve manager now had a live demonstration of political risk. Foreign reserves are only yours if you can still access them when you need them most. Gold stored at home reduces that counterparty risk. By 2024, gold had become the world's second largest global reserve asset at market prices, behind only the US dollar. Some central banks have cared more about where the gold sits. Repatriation, moving gold home, has become part of the strategy. Trust has layers. After sanctions and rising geopolitical division, countries ask what they own if the safest paper becomes unreachable. Gold is the answer. Not the only answer, but the oldest one. Hit subscribe because the next part is what they never put in textbooks. When confidence is high, money is a web of mutual trust. When the web trembles, reserve managers ask what they own that is neutral. Gold buying is not always a bet against the dollar. Often it is a bet against fragility itself and the permission structure of assets. The human cost of broken monetary trust ends in the kitchen. Argentina, in 2001, saw withdrawals limited to 250 pesos a week. Cyprus in 2013 and Greece in 2015 showed that one weekend, the number in the account can change its meaning. Digital balances can become ration cards. Lebanon after 2019 is the harshest reminder. When a money system breaks, saltwater enters the house and floorboards swell. Survivors shared 3 traits. They respected concentration risk, valued liquidity before they needed it, and knew the difference between assets and permissions. When central banks stop trusting one another, they reach for the asset that does not need another government's promise to exist. This is historical analysis, not financial advice. Share this with one person who needs to hear it. Subscribe for more. See you in the next one.